No one expected Jerusalem to become the moment everything changed, not because the city had never seen conflict before, not because tensions had ever truly disappeared, but because some places in the world carry a weight beyond geography, beyond politics, beyond strategy. They are symbols, they are fault lines of history itself, and when something happens there, it does not stay local, it does not remain contained, it echoes outward. That night, the air felt wrong before anyone understood why. People would later describe it the same way: an unusual stillness, the kind of silence that settles over a city before something breaks. The streets were quieter than normal, conversations shorter, eyes lifting to the sky more often than usual. Everyone knew the region was tense. Everyone knew escalation had been building for weeks. But even then, few believed the threshold would actually be crossed. Then the sirens began, not slowly, not in isolated districts, everywhere. The sound cut across the city like a blade, sharp and immediate, ripping through the quiet with the kind of urgency that freezes the blood before the mind can process it. Families stopped mid-sentence, drivers slammed brakes, crowds scattered, people ran not because they understood what was happening, but because instinct took over. Before thought, inside military command centers, screens lit red all at once. Radar operators stared in disbelief as the incoming tracks multiplied across the system. One signal became three, three became 10, 10 became dozens. Confirm launch origin, no answer. Then again, confirm launch origin now, a pause, and then the words no one in that room wanted to hear. Iran. The room changed instantly, because until that moment, every scenario, every simulation, every strategic conversation had lived in the realm of possibility, theoretical, planned for, discussed, war gamed endlessly, but still hypothetical. Not anymore. Now it was real, and worse than real, because the missiles weren't aimed at some remote installation. They weren't headed for empty desert. They were coming toward Jerusalem, toward one of the most sensitive, symbolically explosive locations on Earth. That's when the interceptors launched. The sky exploded into motion as defense systems activated across the region. Trails of fire streaked upward, racing to meet the incoming barrage. Explosions burst high above the city, each one briefly turning night into daylight. For a moment, people thought maybe the system had it handled, maybe this would end in the sky, maybe the defenses would hold, and then one didn't, then another, and suddenly the sound changed, not the distant thunder of interception, but the unmistakable roar of impact, a flash on the horizon, then another, then one so close the ground itself seemed to jump beneath people's feet. The city shook, windows shattered, dust rolled through the streets. Somewhere, screams broke out. Somewhere else, alarms failed. Somewhere else, phones stopped working entirely. And in that instant, Jerusalem was no longer watching war from afar. War had arrived. What followed in the next few minutes would be replayed across the world again and again. Grainy footage from rooftops, shaking cell phone videos, streams of smoke rising above ancient stone, fire reflecting off walls that had stood for centuries, people running through streets with expressions that didn't look like fear alone but disbelief. Because this wasn't supposed to happen here, not in the city. Every major power on Earth watches with unmatched sensitivity, and that's when the realization hit globally. This was no longer a regional flare-up, no longer a contained exchange, no longer something diplomats could dismiss as another episode in an endless cycle. The threshold had been crossed, because once Jerusalem is struck, every calculation changes. Markets reacted before governments did. Oil surged within minutes, defense stocks spiked, airlines began rerouting flights, embassies activated emergency protocols. Across capitals from Washington to Moscow to Beijing, leaders were pulled from meetings, awakened from sleep, rushed into briefing rooms, phones lit up, secure lines opened, and one question dominated every conversation: what happens now? Because everyone knew the answer was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. Nothing stays the same after this. Military analysts immediately understood the strategic implications. This wasn't just an attack, it was a signal, a declaration that previous red lines no longer existed, that assumptions of restraint had collapsed, that deterrence, once thought stable, had broken apart, and when deterrence breaks, everything gets more dangerous. Across Israeli command structures, mobilization orders expanded instantly, reserve units activated, airbases surged to full readiness, naval patrols increased, border deployments doubled, not because retaliation was being considered, because retaliation was inevitable. The question was never if, only how hard. Meanwhile, across Iran, military readiness also surged. Air defenses activated nationwide, strategic assets dispersed, underground facilities opened, leadership moved to hardened positions, because Tehran understood something too. Once Jerusalem had been hit, Israel's response would not be limited, it would be overwhelming, and both sides knew it. That mutual understanding created something even more dangerous than anger, certainty, because when both sides believe escalation is unavoidable, restraint disappears. In Washington, emergency meetings stretched in two. The early morning, intelligence officials briefed defense leadership in rapid succession. Satellite images, radar data, intercepted communications, every piece of incoming information painted the same picture. This was not symbolic. This was not accidental. This was deliberate, and deliberate actions demand deliberate responses. The pressure mounted instantly. Some demanded intervention, others warned against it. Some argued America had no choice but to stand visibly with its ally. Others warned that doing so could ignite a regional war unlike anything seen in generations. Because if the United States entered directly, then everything expands, the Gulf ignites, shipping lanes close, oil prices skyrocket, regional militias activate, global markets spiral, and suddenly the world is no longer watching a war, it's living inside the consequences of one. But beyond the politics, beyond the strategy, beyond the military maps and briefing documents, something else had shifted to psychology, because the strike shattered an idea many had quietly believed, that some places were too sacred, too dangerous, too globally sensitive to ever be directly targeted. That belief died the moment the missiles landed, and when long-held assumptions die, fear rushes in to replace them. Citizens everywhere felt it, not just in Israel, not just in the Middle East, around the world, because people understand instinctively when history bends. And that night felt like history bending. It felt like the old rules no longer applied, like the invisible limits that had prevented wider catastrophe were suddenly gone. That feeling spread through headlines, through social media, through whispered conversations in offices and homes, and this is different. No one needed to explain why. Everyone could feel it. Even the language changed overnight. Commentators stopped saying tensions, stopped saying escalation, stopped saying exchange. Now the words were larger: war, regional conflict, global implications. And beneath those words was an even heavier truth, that no one really knew where this ended, because wars start much more clearly than they end. The strike on Jerusalem became more than a military event. It became a dividing line in history, a before and after. Before, there was still uncertainty about how far things might go. After, everyone knew the answer, farther than anyone had hoped. Scott Ritter and others who had warned about the fragility of deterrence pointed to the moment as proof that the strategic architecture of the region had fundamentally shifted, that the old assumptions about what states would and wouldn't do had collapsed, that the post-Cold War framework of controlled confrontation was no longer functioning. Whether people agreed or disagreed with that interpretation, one fact remained undeniable: the world was reacting as if it were true. Insurance markets adjusted, military budgets were reevaluated, defense ministries accelerated procurement discussions. Governments reviewed emergency reserves, because one strike had changed more than one battlefield. It had changed expectations, and expectation shapes policy as much as reality. In Jerusalem itself, morning arrived in smoke. Emergency crews moved through debris as cameras captured the aftermath: broken glass, damaged buildings, streets coated in dust, religious landmarks untouched in some places, shaken in others. But the symbolism of the strike mattered more than any physical damage ever could, because symbols drive memory, and memory drives history. Children who lived through that night would remember it forever. Leaders who watched it unfold would govern differently afterward. Generals who studied it would plan future wars around it, because once a precedent is set, it cannot be unset, only answered. And the answer was coming. Everyone knew it. Pilots prepared aircraft, ships repositioned, missile crews stood ready, strategists reviewed target packages already waiting in sealed folders for the moment authorization came. The only uncertainty now was timing: hours, days, a week. But no one believed the strike would go unanswered, because the cost of not responding would be too high. It would signal weakness, it would invite repetition, it would destroy credibility, and in geopolitics, credibility is survival. That's why the world waited in fear, not because of what had happened, but because of what everyone knew would follow. The first strike is rarely the most dangerous moment. The response is, because responses escalate, responses widen wars, responses make temporary crises permanent, and when that response comes after something as symbolically massive as Jerusalem being struck, it rarely comes small. The night Jerusalem was hit became more than an event. It became the moment people realized the future they feared had arrived, that the era of contained conflict was ending, that old deterrents were weakening, that sacred boundaries no longer guaranteed safety, and perhaps most chilling of all, that once one unimaginable thing happens, the next unimaginable thing becomes easier to imagine. That is how the world changes, not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, in one night, in one strike, in one moment when history tears open and everything afterward feels different. And from that night on, every leader, every soldier, every civilian watching understood the same truth: whatever came next would shape the world for years to come.